That's what you think is appropriate care for these children? Quote, a disturbing pattern has emerged whereby the same sponsor applies to receive multiple UACs, sometimes at the same address, sometimes at a different one. Some individual sponsors apply to receive more than one child at more than one address simultaneously. One address in Texas had 44 children sent to it. Another had 25. One sponsor in Bonita Springs, Florida had multiple children sent to multiple addresses, and he applied using different versions of his hyphenated surname. One address in Austin, Texas, a town which I represent, had more than 100 UAC released to a single family dwelling. Mr. Secretary, is this remotely consistent with the claims by your department that you're doing everything in your power to ensure child security?
Congressman, thank you for the question. All potential sponsors, anyone who wishes to apply to sponsor a child, must undergo extensive vetting process that follows child welfare best practices. We use a variety of tools. We try to monitor as best we can. And recently, through the foundational rule, we have established an even more extensive process for vetting as well.
Do you believe that the HHS foundational rule from April 30th of 2024 is consistent with what you just said in terms of background checks? Is it sufficient?
The foundational rule is what we've built to try to give us a better way to not only care for kids, but also make sure.
Does it require full public records background checks?
I'm sorry?
Does it require full public records background checks and FBI national criminal history checks?
As I said, we follow child welfare best practices when it comes to.
Yes or no, though? Do you do the full criminal history checks for the potential sponsors of these children?
Well, yes, we follow best practices.
Right. The answer is no.
It's a yes, we follow child welfare best practices.
Yeah, that's not my question. My question is, do you do background checks, the full criminal records, public background checks for the FBI national criminal history?
We certainly check for criminal records. We check for offender in the offender registry. We do, again, the different things that the foundation.
The rule I'm talking about says you do not.
I'm sorry?
The rule that we're talking about that was released on April 30th, 2024 says you do not.
We do not what?
That you do not carry out FBI national criminal history checks for all potential sponsors.
We do background checks on every individual.
Right, but that's a slippery description. What I'm saying is this rule is pretty clear in what it's saying that you do not provide the kind of background checks, which, by the way, has created the problems. Let me move on because in the interest of time. Are you familiar with Maria Gonzalez, an 11-year-old girl who lived in Pasadena, Texas? In August 2023, Ms. Gonzalez was allegedly murdered by Juan Carlos Garcia Rodriguez, a Guatemalan national who appealed at the southern border as a UAC in January of 2023 and was 17 years old. A month later, HHS released Garcia Rodriguez to a sponsor with a criminal history and who previously had 2 other UACs in his care, failed to enroll them in school as required by HHS. How about the situation with respect to another individual, Kayla Hamilton? Are you familiar with Walter Javier Martinez? Martinez was a 17-year-old from El Salvador who appeared at the border as a UAC in March of 2022. Months later, in July 22, he murdered Kayla Hamilton, a 20-year-old woman in Maryland. After Martinez's release from the border and before Mrs. Hamilton's tragic death, HHS released him to a sponsor in May of 2022. Despite Martinez having gang tattoos and an arrest record for illicit association with MS-13. Mr. Secretary, how can you credibly claim that HHS is working to protect these children? And by the way, children we're talking about in the order of magnitude of 400 and something thousand children, which you are dismissing that they are lost. Let me ask you a very specific question, Mr. Secretary. Can you account for the whereabouts of those 400 and something thousand children? The 320,000 that were put in the report by the Inspector General, the 85,000 that we've talked about before in 2023. Do you know where all of these children are and that they are safe? Yes or no?
Congressman, as I explained the process, we get these kids when they are referred to us by the Department of Homeland Security. We then provide them with care while they are in our custody. We lose custody of those kids once we find a vetted sponsor with whom they can stay.
A vetted sponsor that murders the people that they're entrusted to because you issue a rule that doesn't even do the background check? That's what you think is appropriate care for these children? I yield back, Mr. Chairman.